Today is the 14th of March, 2017. I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and we are having a discussion with Dave DeWitt of the Athens News. This is called Athens Speakout number 398. And the topic is the third short review of Bernie Sanders' book called Our Revolution, A Future to Believe In, published in New York by St. Martin's Press in 2016. And I am an emeritus associate professor, and I'm trying to write a book review that will eventually be published, and this is the third short review. Now, in part two of these memoirs, Bernie explains his social and economic issues, and his foreign policy does not seem to have had much importance in this account of the 2015-2016 primary race. Now, those who heard Sanders in his campaign speeches on TV learned more details about Bernie's foreign policy and the role of Jews in America than reading this later memoir and book, Our Revolution, which was revealed in September of 2016 at the end of the convention. Now, I made an error in the last show when we were talking about this, and when we said that in 1990, Bernie Sanders took his seat in the House of Representatives as an independent and not as a socialist, that two traditional Democrats, Henry Gonzalez, Democrat from Texas, and John Conyers of Detroit, Michigan, who had more than 30 years seniority in Congress, allowed Bernie to caucus with the Democrats, both major parties in the United States Congress, and a majority of the voters were hostile to the very idea of democratic socialism. At least Bernie's issues were more dovish than Hillary Clinton's evasions on the Middle East and problems in the United States. The official campaign began in Iowa and New Hampshire in January and February of 2016, and that was the beginning of a long duel for the Philadelphia Convention between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. The heart of the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign staff was his second wife, Jane O'Mara, who he had married in 1988, and his own 4 children and 3 stepdaughters and 7 grandchildren. Now, Bernie had reached the decision to run for president gradually between November 2014 and April 2015. Meanwhile, he divorced his first wife, Deborah Schilling, in 1966. Long before Bernie was elected mayor of Burlington. As Bernie's presidential campaign went on, he picked up more Gentile, Christian, progressive, liberal, and independent volunteers. Bernie Sanders is the first Jew who publicly campaigned to become the President of the United States. Now, in part two, called The Agenda of the New America, How We Transform Our Country, the subtitle would have made a better title than Sanders' entire book, which might have been chosen by Bernie himself or possibly by the publisher. Both the publisher and Bernie Sanders wanted, in 2015 to 2016, to sell books. The new agenda would make much more sense in light of the negatives of Hillary Clinton's losing in the general election in November of 2016 to Donald F. Trump. So the table of contents in Part 2 lists 10 chapters on this new agenda, which demonstrate Senator Sanders' plans to restore economic prosperity for all classes in America. From the perspective of this historian, Bernie's subtitle would have been a better than the actual title, Our Revolution and a Future to Believe in, as it was published in September 2016 when Bernie sent this manuscript to the publisher. So scattered throughout the author's 10 chapters in Part 2 are 18 graphs and tables, including 2 lists which illustrate Bernie's strength as an economist. So in review, the table of contents begins Chapter 1, Defining the Oligarchy, and this chapter was the second short review, which we did about 2 weeks ago. 2 is the decline of the middle class. We're skipping that. And today we're concentrating on Chapter 3, Ending the Rigged Economy, which will be the major theme here. And then we'll skip 4, 5, 6, 7. And then when we get down to number 10, called Corporate Media, the Threat to Our Democracy and the Conclusions, this will probably be the reviewer's last short review in 1 or 2 weeks from now. So, in reviewing Chapter 1, Defining the Oligarchy, Bernie, yes?
Don't you think Dave might?
All right, okay, Bernie, let's give...
Sure,
Dave.
I'll jump in here.
Good.
And we already talked a little bit about this, defining the oligarchy, and I think that I would just want to point out that we've seen, well, we've always had kind of elite interests ruling the nation. I think that we've seen a slide recently in the past 40 years of upward redistribution of wealth. We've seen exploding wealth and income inequality. We've seen policies since the Reagan era under the guise of supply-side economics that seem to have exacerbated this problem. And finally, with the Citizens United decision, which we talked about last time, we've seen the legalization of political bribery. Now, there's always been influence peddling in Washington, and there's always been lobbyists who are trying to get their way. But with the Citizens United decision, we have explicit legalized political bribery in the form of campaign donations. Justice Anthony Kennedy somewhat famously wrote that political campaign donations do not give the appearance of quid pro quo corruption, which I think is an absurd statement on his part.
I agree with all of that.
And so that brings us up to date with where we're at now with the oligarchy, or what Noam Chomsky is now calling the plutonomy on the global scale.
Well, actually, last time we were supposedly going to finish the oligarchy.
Right.
And we got into a little bit of a debate on the first graph called the percent of voting by family income brackets 2012-2014. And that was a series of bar graphs showing 10 brackets of how people have incomes. So in the first bracket, we have those who make less than $10,000 a year. And in the last 10th bracket, we have those who make more than $150,000 a year. And the point is that in the 10th bracket, who make more than $150,000, 52% of those voters go to the polls and vote. Whereas among the poor, whether they're black or white, they're only at 23% bother to go to the polls. So that's one of the problems of income and race. And we can say that common sense will tell you that most of the blacks were in that 10,000 first bracket category. Now, then we had a second graph which clarified this race a little more clearly, and we had 4 bar graphs divided by whites, Asian Americans, Latinos, and blacks. So if you're white, you wait 11.6 minutes to vote. If you're Asian, you have to wait 15 minutes and 4 seconds to vote. And if you're Latino, 18 seconds, 0.7 minutes. And if you're black, you wait 23 seconds and 23 minutes and 3 seconds. So the conclusion is, in this second short review on the oligarchy, the opposite of oligarchy is democracy. So I think at that point, we are ready to go to the
Well, I just want to make
third
one.
show.
I just want to make one
Yeah.
observation about those statistics that you just shared, and that's that this is no accident.
Okay.
The Republican Party for many years has been enacting voter suppression laws under the guise of voter ID or other requirements, eliminating early voting, such as on Sundays and on weekends, where a lot of church people go to vote together. That's no longer the case. They've been making a concerted effort throughout the various states, usually within state legislatures, to suppress minority votes, to suppress opportunities for early voting, to suppress people from getting to the polls, because they know that when poor people or minorities show up to the polls, they lose, and they don't want to lose. So this is all very intentional. They know these statistics. They know what they can do to get people to not be able to vote, to exercise the franchise. And they design laws, they write laws through things like the American Legislative Exchange Council that are specifically designed to suppress the vote.
Very good. So I guess we'll be talking about today's topic, ending the rigged economy. Surprisingly, Bernie criticizes the long-term Democratic Party's foreign trade policy. The Vermont senator is more specific in denouncing NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, and the U.S. so-called free trade agreements with China. Since 1972-79, both parties have de-industrialized the United States to make high profits from cheap Chinese labor. And President Bill Clinton, in his last year as president in 2000, gave China permanent national trading status. This proposal led to the loss of 3.2 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. Both General Electric and Walmart does more manufacturing of its production in China. Walmart pays its workers $15 an hour in the United States, but the CEO makes $19.4 million in salary. He's making $9,000 an hour. So the foreign trade debt of the United States to China and the growing national debts of the G7, that means the government of the major Western countries, plus China, their debts are unsustainable. So the G7 nations are the United States, Great Britain, France, United Kingdom, Japan, and Italy, and Canada.
I also want to point out the Walton family
Yes.
typically rank between, all 5 members of them rank numbers usually 5 through 10 in the world's richest people.
That's right.
All valued,
Right.
in multi-billions of dollars, usually between $15 to $25
Good.
billion each.
Good, great. Okay, so the Federal Reserve Bank now expands the national debt of the United States every 3 months. And it looks like Janet Yellen is about to raise the interest rates to 2%, which means tight credit. We are heading toward a new recession, believe it or not. Anyway, Bernie has sections on supporting the workers' demands and particularly the women's wants of equal pay and equal work. Bernie would like to make it easier for the unorganized workers to join unions, which would mean modifying the Taft-Hartley Law of 1947. But this demand would be dependent on his or some other Democrat winning the presidency. In light of Donald Trump's victory, Bernie's agenda will be greatly postponed.
I'd like to touch on that
Good.
a little bit too,
Good.
because if you examine exploding wealth and income inequality throughout history, this isn't the first time it's happened. Obviously, we've talked about this before. We're in a second Gilded Age.
Right.
It's much larger than the first, incidentally. The
Good.
first was in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century.
Excellent.
But there are two things that have proven to roll back exploding wealth and income inequality. The first one's fairly horrific. It's total destabilization. It's wars, famine, disease, death, populations going away for all of those reasons and many other reasons. It's basically the society or civilization in question collapsing in and on itself, and a whole new society growing. Now, the second one, which we saw in the 20th century as a first, is organized labor.
Right.
It is unions, it's workers coming together to fight for worker interests against the exploitation of the corporate ownership classes. And there was a fair amount of violence in the labor struggles in the 20th century, no doubt about that. But it was a lot less bloody and catastrophic than the falling of civilizations, which is where inequality was combated before.
Yeah, the New Deal prolonged capitalism.
It did. It
Right.
did. So
Franklin Roosevelt.
So I agree totally with Bernie here that what we need organized labor. We need workers who have the right and the ability to come together for collective bargaining
Right.
and demand better livings, better wages, better benefits, and all these things. And frankly, if the ruling class is unwilling to do that, it's only going to lead to greater catastrophe down the line. So
True.
Either they take their medicine now, or everything is going to fall apart eventually.
True.
And so I'm very much in agreement with Bernie that what we need is organized labor, but I also agree with the election of Donald Trump and Republicans controlling the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate and likely to continue their control over the U.S. Supreme Court. This agenda sees no hope of being enacted in any time soon.
I agree with you.
There's a lot of campaign work that needs to happen before you
Right.
can even begin to give workers rights.
Right. True. Well, going on to a fourth graph in this memoir called Our Revolution, this graph is the length of paid maternity leave, parental leave, for home care. It's an appeal to the mothers and the feminists in 2015. And the graph shows the payments by the most generous nations to the least generous nations. Now, Finland grants its women 40 months of health care with maternity leave as of 2015. Finland is followed by Norway with 23 months payments to the women. Number 17 months, the government pays maternity leaves in Germany for 17 months, 14 months in Japan, and the government and women get leave in Canada for 13 months, 10 months in France, 9 months in the United Kingdom, 6 months in Ireland, 4 months in Australia, and 0 months in the United States, the bottom country in treating women and maternity leave. The United States has more than 23% working mothers who get a minimum of 2 weeks leave to give birth to a child. That's where we are on maternity rights. Now, Congress actually passed a medical leave act in 1993 when Clinton was president and Hillary was working for this, but the payments are totally inadequate compared to most Western countries. So Bill and Hillary Clinton worked to get the passages of this law, but the law has not been funded ever since they retired by the subsequent candidates. So Bernie asserts that in a democratic society, the workers must have a right for a decent job and decent pay. And he has a slogan, let's create full employment. And in theory, that's wonderful. And as a member of Congress and the House of Representatives, Hubert Humphrey tried that in Minnesota way back in 1946. But Congress has never fully funded the Council on Economic Advisors sufficiently to create full employment. Also, Congress never funded the health care because the American capitalist economy. Bernie Sanders advocates recruiting our crumbling infrastructure and creating jobs in new clean energy industry. And the senator is supported the expansion of co-ops where the workers share the profits with the owners. And Bernie then wants real tax reform. Wall Street banks have rigged the economy code or the economic tax code to pay themselves high income and pay as little as they can in taxes. Just as society, people should get back, in a democratic society, a progressive income tax in which the people pay taxes based on the ability to pay.
Can I comment on this?
Sure.
I'd like to take your last point first.
All right.
What we have seen since the Reagan era is a slow dismantling of the progressive tax system that we had in place for most of the 20th century, which led to the biggest growth of the middle class in American history. The New Deal and Great Society tax systems, where the top marginal rate was taxed between 70 and 90% of their income. Now that's down to, I believe, 39.
That's about right.
Maybe
that's
lower.
About right.
But it was lower in the Bush years. It was all the way down to 34. And then that was the result
so Barack
of the Bush
did a little better.
He pushed it up a little bit, and the Republicans accused him of wild, rampant socialism for pushing it up 5 percentage points after they had lowered it over 40 percentage points throughout the previous, 30 years. So obviously, Bernie is right. We do need to get back to a truly progressive income tax. The personal income tax only scratches the surface. Republicans often trot out the line that America has the highest corporate tax rate. Well, it's true that the corporate tax rate is high. It's the third in the world. If the corporations were actually paying their taxes and actually paying that rate. The truth about the American corporate tax system is that there are so many loopholes and so many end arounds to that corporate tax rate that many of the richest corporations in America don't pay any taxes at all. Or they pay very little taxes, or they pay almost nothing with regard to that corporate tax rate. Now, if you want to be honest about the corporate tax rate, I'd be all for lowering what the nominal rate is, and as long as the corporations actually pay it. So lower the rate, sure, but eliminate the loopholes. Now, the other stuff that you mentioned, expansion of co-ops, I think that's a great ideal in an idealized world. I don't know how effective it will be to get, you're going to need a Congress with some serious backbone.
That's right.
To force that onto the corporations.
That is true.
Because it will need forced upon them. They're not going to agree to that.
Right.
Just out of the kindness of their hearts. Corporations don't act out of the kindness of their hearts.
True.
They act for profits, for shareholders.
Right.
That's their whole point. In fact, it's written into American law that they must.
I don't know if they must.
That they have to act in the interests of their shareholders.
Well, that's the corporate charter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Shareholders can sue the CEO for giving too much money to charity.
Yeah.
And they want to get the funds for themselves.
Exactly.
So there are lots of inside fights inside the corporation. But those proxy fights amount to nothing, because 99% of the people who own stocks in AT&T just vote with the management.
Right.
Because there are very few
course.
people can read the fine print of the corporate charter.
And they're too busy working on
Right.
their flop shot on the golf course
Yeah,
instead of
just
reading the
they
actual
just need
details.
the dividends.
As far as infrastructure and the green energy future, again, I think those are great ideas. I think in the Roosevelt years, excuse me, I did it again.
Yeah,
in the
okay.
Roosevelt years of the New Deal, we saw what investing in American infrastructure could do to bring
Right.
jobs, to give people work who can't find
That's Keynesian
work
economics.
anyway.
That's
Yeah,
right.
That's straight Keynesian economics, and it's proved effective. It proved effective in growing the middle class in the 20th
Right.
century. As far as the green energy future goes, it seems obvious to me that if the human species wants to spend any more appreciable amount of time on this planet in a livable way, we have to find a way to live here sustainably. And green energy future, I mean, don't think of it as necessary. It doesn't matter. You could totally ignore the global warming argument and just say that if I have 5 apples to live on and I throw 4 of them away, I'm not going to be able to live on that one apple. We've got to find a way to plant an apple tree and be able to renew our apples, right?
Good, great.
And that's what a green energy future is.
Great. Well, to get back to the theme of this chapter, Bernie gets right at the heart of the matter by attacking Goldman Sachs in particular. The Goldman Sachs banking dominates both political parties, Republican and Democrat. Bush 41, Bush 42, their Treasury departments and Bill Clinton's Treasury Department were infiltrated by the Goldman Sachs banking establishment. According to Bernie, the first villain of this group was Robert Rubin. He was part of the revolving door between Wall Street and the president's cabinet. Rubin, a New York Jew, began his career making millions at the Goldman Sachs by working at buying and selling stocks and bonds for 26 years, plenty of experience. So in 1993, when President Clinton appointed Robert Rubin to head the National Economic Council, we might call it inside trader, although it's officially not true. But anyway, in 1995, Robert Rubin was nominally the Secretary of Treasury, and Rubin persuaded Clinton to repeal Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. This was a major New Deal piece of legislation which defined the difference between an investment bank and separate commercial banks. In other words, according to the rules of Glass-Steagall, West Virginia had a monopoly on the commercial banks inside the state of West Virginia. And on the other hand, the people of Ohio could only save and take out mortgages in an Ohio bank. Thus, there were 48 state bank commercials who remained solvent by borrowing money from the Federal Reserve Bank at a discount rate in bad times. Now, with the repeal of Glass-Steagall by Clinton in 2000, just before he left office, so nobody could criticize him, at the end of his term, this allowed the New York Big 10, Big 12 private investment banks, including J.P. Morgan, Chase, Goldman Sachs, to raid the state banks for capital and export that capital to the global economy. That's how it was done. This was one of the factors that led to the 2004-2008 financial crisis.
Can I stop you for a second? I think
Good.
we're due for a station break.
Okay, well, my name is Robert Whaley. I'm a retired historian, and I always look at the past to predict the future. And journalists are so busy worrying about Trump that they're kind of glossing over the past campaign of Bernie Sanders, and I would like to have this book reviewed by a national publication of some kind, and we are trying to do it in four short TV shows, and we're trying to do this with my partner here, Dave DeWitt, and we're trying to get short reviews of the complex book. Yes, sir.
So where we left off was on the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act,
Right.
which, as you pointed out and Mr. Sanders pointed out, that this had a huge role in leading to the financial crisis that wiped out about $13 trillion worth of value from the American people.
Right.
So what they did is they tore down the wall that separated the commercial from investment banking, and that was erected by Glass-Steagall in the 30s. They tore this down. It was a bipartisan tearing down of it in the late 90s, and this led to a sort of predatory lending on the part of Goldman Sachs and others. Goldman Sachs, by the way, great journalist Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone calls Goldman Sachs the giant vampire squid sucking at the face of America, which I think is probably the most accurate description I've ever heard of Goldman Sachs.
I should put that notes. He writes for that left-wing, what's it?
He writes for Rolling Stone.
Rolling Stone, a kind of, well, it was left-wing politically, but it was a little bit too sexy for my taste. But anyway, he did.
Understandably, but he's a really good writer. He wrote a great book I can bring you to called Griftopia. I suggest everyone read it because Griftopia really lays out how at every level, after Glass-Steagall was repealed, it created this predatory atmosphere where everybody was trying to grift everyone else. So it started with subprime mortgages, people who didn't have good credit scores and wouldn't be approved for a mortgage anyway before. They began to get these loans for homes, and they began to get these homes on these subprime loans. And what these loans did was, when everything fell apart, the mortgage rate doubled and then tripled. And it got so high that these people could no longer afford their mortgages. They were kicked out of their homes. They were foreclosed upon, and that was the foreclosure crisis. Now, how did this happen? How did they all get ruined? The investment banks, Wall Street, packaged these loans with good, regular, non-subprime loans, and then they began trading on them.
Right.
And they began selling them and packaging them, and they had Moody's rate these AAA loans that were actually subprime. And so when they began to fall apart, the whole bubble burst and came crashing in. And it was the American people who paid, because remember, Wall Street got bailed out.
Right.
It was the American people who lost $13 trillion worth of assets and values and homes. And if we let them do it again, they're going to burst another bubble. And again, it's going to be the American people.
They might not survive the next time. Well, anyway, getting back to this theme here of Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin was the first villain, according to Bernie. And then Bernie's opinion, Henry Paulson, a Republican who worked for Goldman Sachs, associated and accumulated millions of shares of stocks and bonds, and became the Republican President George W. Bush 43 insider, and he was nominated to be a Republican to be the Secretary of Treasury in 2006, after the Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan had resigned in disgrace. So in October of 2008, when it looked like Barack Obama was winning in the polls and would win the 2008 presidential election, the big corporation said, well, let's call in both parties. There's going to be a falling of the polls because George W. Bush in 2001, 2003 had made promises of winning wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even civil wars in Pakistan. And the Democratic Party was on a revival in 2006. and it looks like they were going to take the presidency. So anyway, the two houses of Congress went for the Democratic Party in 2006, looking like it would be a November revival for the Republicans. But Secretary Paulson demands that Sanders and Sanders was, let's go a little slower. I got it confused here. Secretary Paulson demanded that Senator John McCain, the Republican candidate from Arizona, and the Democratic candidate, Barack Obama, both come to Washington and sign this bailout agreement. And they had to do that bailout or they wouldn't become president because the United States would be bankrupt. So both candidates were under the gun to sign on the dotted line, and this guy Paulson just wrote a 3-page document. Sign here of the bailout, or you'll never be elected. So they both signed under duress. So Obama then had to bring in the Democratic Senate and House Finance Committees to authorize the extension of the U.S. national debt, unprecedented private bailouts. So the third...
Yeah, and this is the concept of too big to fail.
Too big to fail.
As you have here, this agreement, this idea of too big to fail was basically that the federal government must bail out 10 to 12 private investment banks.
Right.
This is direct state interference in the private economy, first of all, but also that way.
Well, Federal Reserve interference.
So that the federal government and the Federal Reserve System would not go into default, which would have ruined the American, the value of the dollar, the American monetary system, everything in the eyes of the world, as you point out there.
Yeah. So the third villain was Tim Geithner, a rich banker who worked for Goldman Sachs and was the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank from 2003 to 2009 after Alan Greenspan retired. And President Obama was forced to appoint Geithner as his Secretary of Treasury. Revolving door. Go to Republican as long as Goldman Sachs is on top.
Noticing the pattern? The vampire squid has a lot of tentacles.
You got it. So after leaving the Treasury Department, Geithner returns to his new job as president of a multi-million-dollar hedge fund. He goes back and builds up his line of credit from J.P. Morgan with new business, new salaries. Now, the fourth villain is Alan Greenspan. And in Bernie's opinion, he will go down in history as the worst chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank.
If I have any influence on it as a journalist, I will absolutely try to make sure that that's the case, because I'm totally in agreement with Bernie about the dubious
qualifications.
Well, he's an Ayn Rand acolyte.
That's correct.
That's where he began.
That's right.
He began attending cocktail parties with Ayn Rand in New York in the 60s, taking down her philosophy of libertarianism that basically exalts selfishness above anything else.
That's right. That's true. That's true. So I was against Alan Greenspan before Bernie even wrote this book. But I, as a historian, would have gone even further and dug a little bit deeper into this biography of Alan Greenspan. And as you point out, this biography reveals the importance of Ayn Rand. So I had done that even before the campaign began, because I was suspicious of Ayn Rand way back in the 60s, I guess.
And in fact, in Griftopia, again, with the Tiabi, he goes into fairly good detail about the history of Greenspan and Rand and that whole set in the 60s and 70s.
Right. So anyway, when he became Federal Reserve chairman, Greenspan quietly resigned in 2006 because he could predict that the crash was coming. He was an inside statistician who was watching these bubbles.
Right.
Insurance bubble, real estate bubble, Fannie Mae. He said, I better get out now. Anyway, I was a peace-minded Democrat, and I was looking at the votes in Congress, because I was trying to flag down the unsuccessful intervention in these Iraq wars. So in April of 2006, Greenspan made a fantastic statement that he had made a big mistake. While it is true he made a number of mistakes as number one banker, Greenspan had expanded the national debt under the slogan, debt doesn't matter. I would like to put that on his tombstone.
That's his epitaph, yeah.
It certainly does matter.
Yeah.
So I would continue that Alan
I
Greenspan...
keep trying to tell credit card companies that, and they're not buying it.
No, they're not buying
Alan
it.
Greenspan said that
yeah.
doesn't matter.
Yeah,
They
that's
still
true.
want that payment.
That's
though.
right. He's still being quoted. Still being quoted.
It's amazing that his reputation has survived to this day.
Well, among the banking class.
Yeah.
Among the Wall Street insiders. But anyway, in 1951, way back early, before I even took a vote, I was only 21 years old. Truman was president. Alan Greenspan went to this conference in which the Russian emigre, Ayn Rand, was a believer in laissez-faire economics. And she was the main speaker. And her interpretation of laissez-faire goes way beyond Adam Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And she became a fanatic. You couldn't have any regulations whatsoever. Adam Smith, back in 1776, said, yeah, we believe in the free market, but it has certain regulations on Christian Jewish values of honesty. You have to have a weights and measures. You have to have a balanced scale.
I think that the morality of Smith often goes way too overlooked. Most people,
right.
People don't talk about the morality of Smith, but if you read Smith, he's very clear about a lot of that stuff. And the other thing that I think that gets overlooked about Smith often is that Smith wrote often about the freedom of labor. Labor has to be free to move as well, not just capital.
A balanced economy. Rent goes to the landowner. Profits go to the manufacturer. But wages go to the worker. Now, under the recent administration, the growth is all for the capitalists and the wages are stagnant.
Right. And I think this relates to the lack of the free movement of labor, because there is no free movement of the worker now.
That's right. That is true.
But there is free movement of the manufacturing and the capital.
You got it.
And so that creates the imbalance. But
right.
Anyway,
before Alan Greenspan was the Federal Reserve chairman, the last liberal was Paul Volcker, who had been the Federal Reserve chairman under Jimmy Carter. And he had a very austere, hard money policy. He followed the rules of the traditional Federal Reserve Bank. And that is, when the economy is lagging, it will lead to a high unemployment, and it is necessary for the Federal Reserve Bank to take bitter medicine, which means higher interest rates, which means that the consumer can't borrow money for a new car, can't borrow money for a new house, and the unemployment then goes up. And Volcker was this hard money chairman, but he was honest. And the interest rates under Jimmy Carter went way sky high, and he got blamed by the Republicans for highest interest rates. But those highest interest rates were pushed by the oil oligarchy, who led the inflation,
Right.
and the Federal Reserve only passed the inflation on to the steel companies and the workers, and it just was rob Peter to pay Paul. So,
And I think that interest rates were artificially suppressed by
Right.
the Nixon and Ford administrations
True.
before Carter took
they
over.
wanted full employment to make it look good for
Right.
Nixon's reelection. He had a friend at the Federal Reserve Bank. But then when Ford got in there and Clinton, they had to fight inflation.
Right.
Yeah, that was delayed taxes. Well, anyway, the policy would nip inflation in the bud, and that led to this extraordinary high rate of 11.2%. But the pain was felt increasingly in the unemployment levels of the middle class, and that was the rule of the Federal Reserve Bank back in 1913. So anyway, the presidents who want to be popular, and that includes Roosevelt, Johnson, Nixon, and Reagan, and the two Bushes, inflated the money instead of raising the rates, and they expanded the national debt, and we're now up into the trillions. Yellen can't expand it anymore.
No, and the interest rates can't go any lower, so she's going to have to raise them probably this year.
Well, I think she's going to do it in the next 2 months.
Yeah.
They're talking about 2% right now.
Are they?
Yeah. That's the latest headline.
It's inevitable. It has to happen.
So Benjamin Franklin told it like it was, that the American people should watch the national debt. And the national debt is only delayed taxation. And there are two things inevitable: death and taxes. And all presidents, from George Washington to DeWitt David Eisenhower, followed the lead of the Federal Reserve Bank in cooling off the economy through high interest rates. But since Eisenhower, there have been few honest Republicans who were always looking for the short-range profits of their president and their banks. Well, are we ready for another list?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, list number 1 is called Business Model on Wall Street Fraud. And Bernie lists these big banks. Bank of America is the number 1 fraudulent taxpayer. Goldman Sachs is number 2. Anyway, under Bank of America, in August of 2014, they paid $16 billion to settle charges out of court that they had lied to the investors about the mortgages and the securities that they had sold from 2004 to 2009 during the financial bubbles. Now, Goldman Sachs Bank, in April of 2016, Goldman Sachs reached a $5 billion settlement for marketing and selling fraudulent mortgages, unbacked securities, which were the foundation of the housing bubble. In addition, Goldman Sachs paid $550 million to settle another 2010 mortgage crisis. So they pay token fees that sound big to the average
Yeah,
worker.
but they're nothing in compared to what they
What
were
they're gonna
given to
make.
get
Yeah,
taxed
right.
out or their profits.
Right. So that's the gap between the dollar figures, you know. Billion here, billion there, billion. First thing you know, you're going to be talking about real money. Anyway, the third big cheater was Wells Fargo Bank. They're in trouble now. In 2016, Wells Fargo reached a $1.2 billion settlement with the Department of Justice for reckless and shabby underwriting procedures. Number 4, Morgan Stanley Investment Company. Well, they kind of went under. 2016, Morgan Stanley, a financial securities firm, reached a $3.2 billion settlement with the Department of Justice for misleading the investors. Number 5, HSBC Hong Kong, Shanghai Banking Corporation, a British investment bank. HSBC was a British investment corporation originally founded in Shanghai in 1865. Well, in the 90s, the British had to give up Hong Kong under a lease with China, and the banks wanted to get in and make some quick profits before the People's Republic of China foreclosed. So HBC, investment company, in 1991 was reorganized as the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, which is a holding company. There's another fraud, the holding company. That goes back to the trust bust area, the 1890s, A holding company just buys failing other companies and shuffles the profits around. Well, anyway, this holding company, HSBC, had to pay some fine, and Bernie says that in 1516, HSBC reached a $600 million settlement with the Department of Justice for its unsecured mortgage business. So that gives them a fifth rank status as a embezzler. Number 6, Citicorp, New York Investment Bank, 2014. The Citicorp Group reached a $7 billion settlement for mortgage fraud. And Barack Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, said that Citizens Group had contributed to the financial, that's a modest statement, it had contributed to the financial crisis that they invested in the United States in 2008. Okay, number 7, J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. In 2015, J.P. Morgan Chase settled with the Justice Department for $13 billion for lying on Fannie Mae, Fannie Mac federal secured mortgage loans. Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac were originally two New Deal government-backed mortgage companies which financed low-cost housing for the poor back in the 1930s. But under the Republican regime, Fannie Mac and Fannie Mae went into the banking business, and they backed mortgages, financed low-cost housing for the poor by just giving them the mortgage, but the mortgage payments were so high they couldn't keep it up. And when the crash came, they were foreclosed, and these properties went underwater in California, Florida, and Nevada, and so forth and so on. So after the election of Ronald Reagan, Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac lost its original lower middle-class mission and competed with private corporations for new mortgage business. And the poor obtained mortgages with no down payment. And when the stock market bubbles began to crash, the tenants had to vacate the mortgage company because the mortgage was worth more than the property. The people who owned the deed just foreclosed. So, and anyway, the Vermont senator then makes another table, the 10 top corporate advisors. Do you want to stop here and look at those 7 check cheaters a little bit before we go on to another table?
As many of them as we can get.
Oh,
we're only at 2 minutes left,
yeah,
so
well,
we might want to save that for last
we
time.
better stop at this point.
Okay.
And we didn't quite get through, so we're going to have another show next week, Kenneth? Next week?
Next week?
Yeah, we'll call this second part 2
Okay.
of the same title.
Well, that sounds good.
Okay. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Professor.
We got to keep the debate going because debate is the oxygen of democracy, and Trump will not debate anybody. He won't even debate his own Republican Party. What is he going to do?
It's anybody's guess. I don't know. I don't expect him to keep any of his promises.
Good. Anyway.